In the scorching summer of 1940, the Mediterranean Sea became a battleground unlike any other. For the Italian Royal Navy, the Regia Marina, the opening months of the war brought a sense of confidence. With over 100 submarines prowling the azure waters, Italian naval commanders believed they held a decisive advantage. Their boats were modern, their crews were trained, and Mussolini's vision of controlling Mare Nostrum, our sea, seemed within reach. But beneath the surface of this confidence lurked a threat that Italian submariners could not see, could not hear, and could not understand. A silent hunter was stalking them, claiming vessel after vessel with terrifying precision. The Italian submarine force entered the war as one of the largest in the world. 116 submarines of various classes patrolled from Gibraltar to Alexandria, from the Sicilian Channel to the Aegean Sea. The submariners were brave men, volunteers who understood the dangers of their profession. They knew that every dive could be their last, that every patrol brought them face to face with potential disaster. But in those early weeks of June 1940, they could not have imagined the scale of losses that would follow. Within the first month alone, the casualties began mounting in ways that defied explanation. On June 19th, the submarine Galileo Galilei was captured by British forces in the Red Sea. 4 days later, Luigi Galvani went down off the coast of Oman. On June 27th, Console Generale Liuzzi was sent to the bottom near Crete. The pattern was always the same. British destroyers and corvettes would appear seemingly from nowhere and begin their attack with uncanny accuracy. Italian commanders struggled to understand how the enemy was finding their submarines with such consistency. Before we continue with this compelling story, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this narrative engaging and educational, please take a moment to hit that like button below. It really helps us continue bringing you these untold stories from the Second World War. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your support means everything. Now, back to the mysterious disappearances of Italian submarines in the Mediterranean. The Italian Navy's intelligence division worked frantically to piece together what was happening. They knew the British possessed something called ASDIC, a submarine detection system that used sound waves. Before the war, Italian naval officers had even discussed the technology in friendly conversations with their British counterparts during peacetime naval visits and conferences. But the exact capabilities of this system remained shrouded in secrecy. The French Navy also possessed ASDIC equipment, but after France's fall in June 1940, no cooperation was forthcoming. The Italians were left to guess at the true power of the weapon hunting them beneath the waves. Commander Alessandro Vittorini commanded the submarine Gondar in those early months. His patrol orders seemed straightforward enough. Proceed to a designated area south of Crete and intercept British convoys moving between Alexandria and Malta. It was the kind of mission Italian submarines had trained for during countless exercises in peacetime. But this was war, and the rules had changed in ways Vittorini and his crew were about to discover. On September 30th, 1940, Gondar was running submerged in the clear waters south of Crete. The Mediterranean here is remarkably transparent, which made daytime surface operations hazardous. Vittorini kept his boat at periscope depth, sweeping the horizon for targets. The crew was at action stations, torpedo tubes loaded and ready. They had been at sea for 9 days, and every man was eager for a chance to strike at the enemy. At approximately 10 in the morning, the hydrophone operator reported propeller noises, multiple contacts, bearing north-northwest, closing fast. Vittorini raised the periscope for a quick look. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. 2 British destroyers, possibly a third, were heading directly toward Gondar's position. But how? The submarine had made no noise, had not surfaced, had given no indication of its presence. Yet here they were, bearing down on his boat as if they knew exactly where to find it. The first depth charges began falling moments later. The blasts were terrifyingly close, sending shock waves through Gondar's pressure hull. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation rained from the ceiling, and men were thrown against bulkheads. Vittorini ordered the boat deeper, but the British seemed to anticipate every move. More depth charges followed, each pattern methodically placed to bracket the submarine. The attack continued for over 2 hours, relentless and precise. When Gondar finally surfaced, crippled and unable to dive, HMS Stuart and British aircraft finished what the destroyers had started. The survivors were pulled from the water and became prisoners of war. In captivity, Italian sailors compared notes with other survivors from different submarines. All told similar stories. The British seemed to know where they were, even when submerged. They attacked with a precision that conventional lookouts and hydrophones alone could not explain. Throughout the autumn and winter of 1940, the pattern continued. The submarine Barillo was caught and terminated on October 2nd. La Folle followed on October 20th. By the end of the year, the Italian submarine service had lost over 20 boats, many to British anti-submarine forces, using methods that remained mysterious to the Italians. Lieutenant Commander Gianfranco Gazzana Priaroggia was among the more fortunate Italian submarine commanders. His boat, Leonardo da Vinci, was assigned to the Atlantic campaign operating from Bordeaux in occupied France. There, away from the concentrated British anti-submarine forces in the Mediterranean, Italian boats had considerably more success. The Atlantic offered different conditions: fewer escorts, larger areas to search, and convoys that were sometimes caught without adequate protection. Leonardo da Vinci became the most successful non-German submarine of the entire war, sinking over 90,000 tons of Allied shipping. But even Gazzana Priaroggia understood that his success in the Atlantic highlighted the mystery of the Mediterranean. Why were Italian boats so much more effective in the Atlantic? What was different about British operations in the Mediterranean that made submarine operations there so hazardous? The answer lay in a device that the British called ASDIC and that the Americans were calling Sonar. The technology had been developed during the First World War, but had been refined throughout the 1920s and 1930s by British scientists working at HMS Osprey in Portland. By 1939, virtually every British destroyer and escort vessel in the Mediterranean carried ASDIC equipment. The system worked by sending out pulses of high-frequency sound through the water. When these pulses struck a solid object, a submarine's hull, they reflected back as echoes. By measuring the time between transmission and echo, operators could determine the range to the target. By rotating the transmitter like a searchlight, they could determine bearing. A skilled operator could even estimate a submarine's depth and whether it was moving toward or away from the hunting vessel. For Italian submariners who survived encounters with ASDIC-equipped British warships, the experience was terrifying precisely because it was inexplicable. They would be running silent and deep, following all the proper procedures to avoid detection, when suddenly depth charges would begin falling all around them. The British seemed to see through the water itself, tracking submarines with an accuracy that defied conventional understanding. The Italian Navy tried to develop countermeasures based on limited information. They experimented with deeper diving depths, knowing that British depth charges had settings that typically maxed out around 350 feet. Some submarines tried releasing oil slicks or debris to fool British operators into thinking they had scored a hit. Others attempted radical maneuvers at the moment of attack, hoping to evade the depth charge patterns. But without understanding the full capabilities of ASDIC, Italian submariners were fighting blind. They knew something was out there, hunting them with unprecedented efficiency, but the exact nature of that hunter remained a mystery. Dead men tell no tales, and submarines that were sunk took all their knowledge to the bottom. Captain Giuseppe Castellano was not a submariner, but as an intelligence officer in the Italian Navy, he understood the scale of the problem facing the Regia Marina. By 1941, Italian submarine losses in the Mediterranean were approaching catastrophic levels. Nearly 40 boats had been lost, and for every submarine that survived to report back, dozens of theories circulated about British detection methods. Some Italian officers theorized that the British were tracking submarines by their magnetic signatures. Others believed it was radio direction finding, assuming that any transmission, no matter how brief, gave away a boat's position. A few suggested that the British had developed some kind of underwater television that could see through the murky depths. All these theories missed the truth. The British were listening with electronic ears that could reach thousands of yards through the water. The Italian Navy's single experimental anti-submarine vessel, the destroyer Albatross, was equipped with Italian-developed ASDIC equipment designated Safar P-600. But this was a prototype, hastily developed and poorly understood even by Italian operators. It lacked the refinement and reliability of British systems that had been perfected over 2 decades of development. More critically, Italy had invested heavily in building submarines but had neglected the anti-submarine warfare capabilities that might have taught them what they faced. As the war progressed into 1942 and 1943, conditions in the Mediterranean became increasingly difficult for Italian submarines. British anti-submarine tactics improved dramatically. The Royal Navy developed new weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that allowed escorts to attack while maintaining as-sea contact. Previously, destroyers had to pass over a submarine to drop depth charges from the stern, losing ASDIC contact in the crucial final moments of the attack. The British also perfected the creeping attack, a coordinated maneuver involving 2 ships. One vessel, the directing ship, would maintain ASDIC contact with the target submarine, while a second ship, with its ASDIC turned off and running slowly, would approach from another direction to drop depth charges. The submarine commander couldn't hear the attacking vessel coming and had no warning until the charges began exploding around his boat. By 1943, Italian submarines in the Mediterranean were achieving less than 3% hits on their torpedo attacks. The few convoys that transited between Gibraltar, Malta, and Alexandria were fast and heavily escorted, protected by multiple layers of defense, including ASDIC-equipped destroyers, radar-equipped aircraft, and radio direction finding that could locate submarines attempting to report convoy positions. The Battle of the Mediterranean had become a war of technology as much as courage, and in this dimension the Regia Marina was fighting at a severe disadvantage. Italian submarines were designed well for surface running, but dove slowly compared to their German counterparts. Their large conning towers, impressive in harbor, made them more visible on the surface and slowed their crash dives. In the crystal-clear waters of the Mediterranean, under cloudless summer skies, these disadvantages proved fatal time and again. Then, in the summer of 1943, everything changed. On July 25th, Benito Mussolini was deposed by the fascist Grand Council. King Victor Emmanuel III and Marshal Pietro Badoglio immediately began secret negotiations with the Allies. By early September, an armistice was signed. On September 8th, the announcement was made. Italy was switching sides. The Italian battle fleet, including the pride of the Regia Marina, immediately sailed for Malta to surrender to Allied forces. It was during this journey that the battleship Roma was struck by German Fritz Zecke's guided bombs, becoming one of the first warships ever sunk by guided missiles. But most of the fleet reached Malta safely, and with the armistice came something Italian sailors had been seeking for 3 long years: answers. In the days and weeks following the armistice, Italian naval officers were given access to British facilities. For the first time, they saw ASDIC equipment up close. They watched British operators demonstrating the system, saw the distinctive dome that housed the transducer beneath the ship's hull, and observed the plotting tables where submarine contacts were tracked with mechanical precision. For Commander Luigi Manunta, a survivor from the submarine Adua, which had been sunk in September 1941, the experience was revelatory. He stood in the operations room of a British destroyer, watching as operators demonstrated the ASDIC system using a friendly Italian submarine as a target. The characteristic ping of the sonar pulse echoed through the water. Seconds later, the return echo came back, and a light flashed on the range indicator. The bearing dial showed the submarine's position with startling accuracy. Manunta thought back to his last patrol aboard Adua. They had been near Cape Palos, off the Spanish coast, attempting to intercept the British convoy Operation Halberd, returning from Malta. At dawn on September 30th, 1941, Adua had been running submerged when British destroyers appeared. The attack had been immediate and devastating. Manunta now understood why. The destroyers had been tracking Adua with ASDIC, probably for some time before the attack began. His submarine had never had a chance to escape. Other Italian officers experienced similar moments of understanding. Captain Angelo Perona had commanded the submarine Turchese before being captured in 1942. Seeing the ASDIC display for the first time, he realized that every evasive maneuver he had attempted, every change of depth or course, had been visible to his British pursuers. The technology could track a submarine's movements in real time, plotting its course and speed, predicting its position, even when momentary contact was lost. The revelation was humbling. Italian submariners had attributed their heavy losses to British skill, courage, and luck. Now they understood that technology had been the decisive factor. The British hadn't just been braver or more determined. They had possessed a weapon that made submarine detection not a matter of chance, but of systematic scientific application. Lieutenant Pietro de Cristofaro, who had survived the loss of his submarine in 1942, spent hours discussing ASDIC with British operators. He learned about the system's limitations, how thermal layers in the water could deflect the sound waves, how schools of fish or whales could produce false echoes, how the operator's skill was crucial in distinguishing real targets from spurious contacts. But de Cristofaro also learned about the system's strengths. ASDIC could detect a submarine at ranges up to 2,000 meters in good conditions. The operator could not only locate the target but could track it continuously, calling out range and bearing updates to the bridge. This allowed attacking destroyers to maintain contact right up until the final moment of attack, dramatically increasing the probability of a successful engagement. The British were generous with their information, understanding that Italy was now a co-belligerent fighting against Germany. Italian crews were needed to operate their surviving submarines in operations against German forces in occupied Italy. To do this effectively, Italian officers needed to understand the technologies they would be working alongside. The impact of these revelations spread through the Italian Naval Officer Corps. Men who had lost friends and comrades in submarine operations now understood the true odds they had been facing. It was not that Italian submarines had been poorly designed or that Italian crews had lacked skill. They had been fighting against a technology that neither they nor their German allies had properly understood or countered. The Germans had made a critical error early in the war. They concluded that submarines should not be equipped with active sonar because the emissions would reveal a submarine's position to enemy anti-submarine forces. This reasoning had seemed logical, but it meant that German and Italian submarines operated without one of the most powerful tools available to Allied submarines. British, American, and Dutch submarines routinely used their sonar in both passive listening mode and active ranging mode, giving them a significant advantage in submarine versus submarine engagements. The revelation also explained why Italian submarines operating from Bordeaux in the Atlantic had been so much more successful. In the Atlantic, especially in the early years of the war, British escort forces were stretched thin. Convoys often had minimal protection, and the vast ocean spaces meant that ASDIC-equipped escorts couldn't be everywhere at once. But in the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where every convoy route was known and heavily defended, ASDIC coverage was comprehensive and deadly. Former Lieutenant Commander Mario Rossetto had commanded submarines in both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. After seeing ASDIC demonstrated, he compared his experiences in both theaters. In the Atlantic, he had felt like a hunter, stalking merchant ships across vast expanses of ocean. In the Mediterranean, he had felt like prey, constantly aware that danger lurked nearby, but unable to identify its exact nature. Now he understood why. The Mediterranean had been covered by a network of ASDIC-equipped escorts that made sustained submarine operations nearly impossible. The Italian Navy incorporated these lessons into its operations as a co-belligerent force. Italian submarines conducted special operations along the German-occupied Italian coast, and Italian escort vessels worked alongside British forces in anti-submarine operations. For Italian sailors, there was a mixture of emotions: professional respect for British technological achievement, frustration at their own Navy's failure to develop comparable systems, and sadness for the many comrades who had gone down not knowing what was hunting them. The ASDIC revelation also prompted broader discussions about Italy's wartime preparation. Why had the Regia Marina entered the war with only one experimental anti-submarine vessel? Why had so much investment gone into building submarines while anti-submarine technology was neglected? These questions had no easy answers, but they highlighted fundamental flaws in Italian naval doctrine and procurement priorities. Some Italian officers pointed out that the Regia Marina had actually begun developing ASDIC-type equipment before the war. The Sonar company had produced the experimental sets, and there had been discussions with British naval personnel about submarine detection methods. But these efforts had been sporadic and underfunded. When war came, Italy possessed the form of an anti-submarine capability without the substance. The Germans eventually developed their own sophisticated submarine detection equipment, the S-Jarret, similar to ASDIC. But as noted earlier, German naval doctrine dictated that submarines should not use active sonar for fear of revealing their positions. This left German U-boats vulnerable to Allied submarines equipped with sonar, just as Italian boats had been vulnerable to British escorts. After the war ended in 1945, Italian naval historians began conducting a comprehensive analysis of the Regia Marina's submarine campaign. The statistics were sobering. Of the 116 submarines Italy possessed at the start of the war, 85 were lost to enemy action or accidents. The majority of these losses occurred in the Mediterranean, where British anti-submarine forces were concentrated and ASDIC coverage was most comprehensive. In the Atlantic, Italian submarines achieved a much better exchange rate, sinking over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping while losing significantly fewer boats. This disparity underscored what Italian sailors had finally learned in 1943: technology matters. In the Atlantic's vast spaces, Italian submarines could operate with some degree of safety. In the Mediterranean's confined waters against an enemy equipped with advanced detection equipment, they had been at a devastating disadvantage. The story of Italian sailors witnessing Britain's ASDIC network became a case study in the importance of technological intelligence in warfare. Italian submariners had known that ASDIC existed. They had even discussed the basic principles with British officers before the war. But knowing that a technology exists and understanding its full operational capabilities are two entirely different things. British security around ASDIC had been excellent. While Italian intelligence knew the basics, They had no detailed information about range, accuracy, operational procedures, or tactical applications. This intelligence gap proved fatal for dozens of submarines and hundreds of submariners. When the truth finally became clear in September 1943, it explained so many mysteries, answered so many questions about why Italian submarines had struggled so desperately in the Mediterranean. For the British, the ASDIC system represented decades of research and development. From the early experiments during World War I through the refinements of the interwar period, British scientists and naval officers had worked to perfect submarine detection. By 1939, they possessed the most advanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities in the world. This investment paid enormous dividends during the Battle of the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean campaign. The encounter between Italian sailors and British ASDIC technology in 1943 represents one of history's great moments of military revelation. Men who had fought and suffered without understanding their enemy finally saw the truth. The British had not just been lucky or skilled. They had possessed a decisive technological advantage that Italian and German forces had failed to match or adequately counter. Commander Manunta, watching that ASDIC demonstration in Malta in late 1943, felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was the satisfaction of finally understanding what had happened to him and his crew aboard Ottawa. There was professional admiration for the British system's elegant design and effectiveness. But there was also profound sadness for all the men who had gone to the bottom without ever knowing what was hunting them. He thought of his former crew, good men who had followed orders without question, who had faced danger with courage, who had done everything asked of them. They had lost not because they were inadequate, but because they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, unaware of the opponent's true capabilities. That knowledge brought no comfort, but it did bring understanding. In the years after the war, veterans of the Italian submarine service would occasionally gather to share memories and stories. Invariably, the conversation would turn to that revelation in 1943, when they finally understood what they had been facing. Some spoke with bitterness about Italian leadership's failure to properly prepare them. Others focused on admiration for British technical achievement. But all shared a sense that they had been part of a larger story about technology, warfare, and the sometimes cruel nature of combat, where knowledge can mean the difference between life and death. The legacy of this experience influenced post-war Italian naval development. The Italian Navy invested heavily in anti-submarine warfare capabilities, determined never again to be caught at such a disadvantage. Italian engineers studied Allied sonar technology and developed domestic capabilities. The lessons learned, paid for so dearly in submarine losses between 1940 and 1943, shaped Italian naval doctrine for generations. Today, advanced sonar systems are standard equipment on all anti-submarine warfare vessels. The technology that Italian sailors finally witnessed in 1943 has evolved into sophisticated systems that can track submarines across vast distances, distinguish between different types of underwater contacts, and guide weapons with extraordinary precision. But the basic principle remains the same: using sound waves to see through water, to hunt submarines that might otherwise remain invisible. For the men of the Regia Marina who survived to see ASDIC demonstrated in 1943, the experience was transformative. They finally understood why so many of their comrades had never returned from patrol, why Italian submarines had struggled so badly in the Mediterranean, why every encounter with British escorts had seemed to go so disastrously wrong. The truth, when it came, was both enlightening and sobering. The story serves as a reminder that in warfare, technological superiority can be as important as courage or skill. The Italian submariners who went to sea between 1940 and 1943 were brave men undertaking a dangerous mission, but bravery alone was insufficient when facing an enemy equipped with detection technology that could penetrate the ocean's depths and locate targets with scientific precision. As we close this story, I want to thank you for staying with us through this incredible historical narrative. If you found this fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with others who appreciate military history. Drop a comment below telling us what other untold stories from the Second World War you'd like us to explore. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important historical accounts to light. The revelation experienced by Italian sailors in 1943 was a moment of clarity that came too late for the hundreds of men who had already perished beneath the Mediterranean waves. But for those who survived, for the historians who would later study these events, and for us looking back across the decades, it stands as a powerful illustration of how technology shapes warfare and how the fog of war can sometimes obscure the most fundamental truths about the battles we fight. The Italian sailors who finally witnessed Britain's sonar network understood perhaps for the first time exactly what they had been fighting against, and in that understanding they found both answers to old questions and profound respect for the technological achievement that had defeated them.